Okay, thank you. Okay, welcome everyone to the first Equity, Diversity and Inclusion talk organized by the ICE Equity Committee. The Equity Committee has a number of different charges aimed at promoting and improving diversity and gender balances and fight labor, social and sexual harassment. For instance, as a result of the committee's work, a code of conduct has been released recently and distributed to the members of the Institute. There are several members of the committee in the audience today. Please raise your hand or stand up, including myself, so that the Institute members know who you are. We are looking for new members of the committee after the summer, and we explicitly invite men and women of any background to volunteer. Today, we're very proud to host the distinguished Jessica Dempsey as our first EDI seminar speaker. Jessica Dempsey was recently, about 1 year ago, appointed director of the Netherlands Institute for Radio Astronomy, ASTRON. She came to the Netherlands following over a decade in Hawaii as the deputy director of the East Asian Observatory, which operates the James Clerk Maxwell Telescope. Jess has a background in radio interferometry with a scientific focus on wide field and transient surveys of the diverse molecules in the galaxy at radio wavelengths and on the frontiers of challenge in big data science pipelines for astronomy. While at the JCMT, she was also a member of the Event Horizon Telescope team. Jess has a passionate commitment to creating greater diversity, equity, and opportunity at all levels of astronomy, and to enhancing opportunities for girls to become future leaders in science and technology careers. Furthermore, Jess was the first Australian female scientist to work at the geographic South Pole, where she spent 5 summers building site testing instruments and a robotic telescope before wintering at the South Pole Station in 2005 for the Arc-Minute Cosmology Bolometer Array Receiver Cosmic Microwave Background experiment.
Well done.
Akbar CMB.
Well done.
Yes. And well, please, yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. That was quite an introduction. I'm very proud to be your first speaker for this series. So I think it's going to be a good, fun place to start. So what I'm going to try and do is motor through the slides and the conversation for about half an hour, because there's a lot to unpack here, and I wanted to get to conversation, and that's the most important thing here is having those discussions. And there's no rules, so if in the middle of this as well, there are questions, or you have something you want me to clarify, please feel free to just just note to me, and we can have that chat in the middle as well. Okay, so does anyone recognize this photo? So this was actually taken in the Iran protests last year, of course, over the focus on punishment of women who were not wearing or covering their hair in an appropriate fashion. And this really, to me, really summarizes the challenge that we have when we face backlashes against an attempt to make a systemic change, against an injustice or an imbalance. So that's why I want to have a conversation today about what those challenges look like, and some of the processes that I'm working on to mitigate those challenges, to actually get forward motion on some of these change movements. So what we're going to do, I'm going to give you a quick background for those of you who might not be aware about what the Me Too movement was. And I'm using this as an example. Yes, it's an example that's very close to me personally, but also this is just an example. There are many cases in our history, both current and current events, that are another examples of where you have protest movements or attempts at change, and then it's that backlash loop that perhaps sets us back to even further than we were before, when some of these movements have pushed back against them from the status quo. I'm also going to have a bit of personal experience about how some of these things came home to me, and maybe that's why I'm using my lessons learned as I go about this. And then how you can analyze this in yourself. When are you reacting in a fear-based way? Are you making decisions based on fear? It's a really useful conversation to have for yourself, and how to find it in other people. Methods for guiding people away, yourself and others, from making decisions based on fear. So actually, we're nearly 6 years on from Me Too now. I do have to change this slide. It was a hashtag by Tarana Burke in 2006. And very quickly, over about 6 months, it evolved into a movement around the world. It was started from a number of high-profile sexual harassment cases, and the adage of, well, me too, as in women stepping up and saying, this is not just a one-off case. This is not just them. This is us as well. And the numbers are staggering. And examples of some of these demographic reporting and people on harassment, and it is in every field, but in just the fields which we represent, in scientific fields, up to 88% of women report experience harassment at some point in their careers. And these overwhelming numbers were why this foundational movement caught fire. And so it's sort of as a theme, what happens to get system-wide resistance? You have to unify enough of a marginalized group or an under pressure group around a single common issue, and that starts to pressure an existing system. That's how change movements happen. That's how protest movements happen into change movements. But what underlying it happens is this bottom part. Of course, any of these movements threaten the current power structure. And this is what I'm going to be talking more about today. Did we succeed? Did Me Too actually get us anywhere? It's a really hard and painful question for some of us. You could say on the face of it, yes. And the most notable example is at the top, Harvey Weinstein serving 23 years, and that was just the first round of legal cases against him, multiple high-profile celebrity cases, and then you can talk about the cases in science and technology. There are people being reported and successfully asked to step out of their scientific careers now that perhaps would not have had this happen to them 10, 20 years ago, perhaps not even 5 years ago. So then that followed on, and I'm really pleased to mention the code of conduct here, a wave of policies on new codes of conduct, training on harassment prevention, unconscious bias training, a network for reporting victims. So you could look on the face of it and say, yes, actually, Me Too was a success. But on the heels of some of these successes is what I call the hashtag #MeNext rises. And this is a particular example of it, and a particularly painful one for anyone, and especially, if you're a woman in the United States when this was happening, but I think around the world it resonated for a lot of us, which is Brett Kavanaugh's reaction when the allegations of harassment and assault were brought to Congress when he was being considered for the Supreme Court. And this is a really good distillation of the problem, right? And this is she's a PhD researcher. She was calm, she was poised, she was brave, she was vulnerable, she was believable. In fact, everybody who actually sat there in the courtroom said they actually believed her story. And in response, you had this petulant, aggressive, vicious, self-righteous individual, and he was victorious. What on earth went wrong? And so this is where it's very important to understand Brett Kavanaugh isn't the face of the #MeNext movement. It was the men making the decision about his guilt and what should happen. These are the people who are quietly making the decisions because they are identifying more with who? They're identifying more with the man in the chair than they are with the victim. And this is not pointing fingers at people of blame. This is simply a natural reaction. So if you diagnose #MeNext, what are the symptoms? And you may have heard some of these. Is that true? Are you sure? Did this happen to you? What about you? Maybe if you tell me your story, then maybe I'll believe that this is sort of happening. So this is sort of victim methodology, where you actually need, the truth of it, the touch of it. You start these disbelief systems, which for victims of this is incredibly traumatizing. I just need more proof. There's particularly in scientific cases, right? Give me the data. Where's the numbers? Show me the real proof of this is really happening. Then you get the defensive reactions. Well, now I can't even look at a woman anymore. What am I doing? Now, what is my appropriate level of reaction, right? So then you're starting to push back to the people who are reporting. All of now the responsibility is being pushed away from these people onto the victims. And this one is a summary of it. My worry is just now anyone could report for no reason and just damage someone because they feel like it. And if I had $1 or €1 for every time I have heard this when working through some of these cases, I could retire. So it's a very scary time for young men in America. You could be somebody that was perfect your entire life and somebody could accuse you of something. This was a delightful orange-colored ex-president that said this. And yet it was really symptomatic of the belief in general. And yet, would you believe this? Multiple studies, actually measure or estimate the maximum false reporting rate at less than 2%. And new studies actually say even that 2% is probably an overestimate, because those false reportings are from women or other victims who were badgered into withdrawing their complaint and admitting it was false because they couldn't prove it. When you do that, you get back down to maybe this ridiculously small fraction here. And if you compare that to the amount of success rate of actually, especially in legal cases, any of these assaulters actually being jailed or having any punishment, well, the numbers speak for themselves. And this is where I say you have more sympathy for someone like yourself. Sympathy for the accused is when you have a demographic largely making decisions of these kinds, and they're the mostly worried about, and they can mostly identify with, the accused rather than the accuser. And so when you have unconscious sympathy, I do say unconscious, this is not a deliberate frame of mind, we have implicit bias towards others like ourselves. And the other part is, it's even worse when you do empathize with the victim. These are painful things. And if you do not have the emotional intelligence and training to deal with that level of empathy and trauma, you shut down and you are now blaming the person who made you feel vulnerable. So me next is gaining momentum. And I can bring you a bunch of other even worse statistics than the ones here. We have increases statistically in male leadership refusing to hire women or have one-on-one meetings. You're seeing hamperings of careers. These are already systemically happening. You are seeing what I call the war on women, not just in Iran. You're seeing it in Poland in some of the laws being withdrawn and withheld on abortion. Of course, you can go to the US. Most of these are US statistics. Escalation of laws regarding rights to self, not just in abortion ways, over litigation against women and particularly women of color. An interesting one, particularly in science cases, right when I was giving this talk last, two male academics from, I'm going to get the Scandinavian country incorrect, was Finland, who got Christian Ott not hired at their university. Christian Ott was suing them for defamation of character. Fortunately, they won. But this is an example of what I'm going to talk about in a little bit, which is this: when you threaten someone's sense of self, they will go to the mat for this. And the pressure and the balance is so much into these majorities that most people are inclined to give in to this. All right. This is all a lot, yeah? We're going to have a little break. I'm going to take you to New Zealand. I'm going to tell you a love story. When I was in university, I met this incredible Māori artist, nicknamed Bub, who had this huge afro of incredible brown Māori hair. And we fell in love and got married. And he brought me across to New Zealand for the first time. He is part of a tribe called the Ngāti Porou. They are from the East Cape of the North Island, just north of Gisborne. And this is actually the drive to Mount Taranaki, which is one of the Māori sacred mountains. In fact, it's the first, because of the time zone change, to see the sun in the world. And he was a delightful guy and an amazing artist, and gave me precisely zero warning that he was about to drop me into the most isolated, hardcore, extreme Māori indigenous tribe on the earth. And I had no clue what to expect. At that point, I had this bleach blonde hair. I was the only white person in town. And all of his uncles, or, you know, and all of the men in the tribes that had greeted me just fine, you know, that was fun. The women of the tribe did not want me there. It was brutal. from like day one. It was like, you could imagine, you know, the worst sort of trial by fire you could ever have. And it was like, you're going to take him away from us. We don't need white girls in this town. And this was 7 years of just unwelcome, not welcome. And I'd never represented a colonialist empire before in one go. And yet that was what I was hit with. And my lovely, lovely husband was largely clueless about it. You know, I was not getting any help from that factor. And this was the first time I felt this really indignant rage, like fighting in me to go, well, this isn't fair. I mean, haven't done anything. I just, think it was cool. So I brought all of my, complete cluelessness about colonialism, my inherent and intrinsic, unspoken racism, all of this just bubbled up. And I'll tell you some of the things that sort of went through my mind as these women were sort of pulling me through my paces. It's like, I didn't deserve this. I am not responsible for all of this. Why is this suddenly on me? I'm a good person. I don't want you to judge me like this. Can you just please stop? And then it gets worse. It's like, well, okay, fine, this isn't working, great. If I don't stop, I'll just stop trying and leave. And it was for his father died. I went back, was there for the funeral, and Maori funerals are intense, several long day sort of matters. And I just stayed in the kitchen and peeled vegetables and cooked kumara and just was, washed dishes. And this was where they started to turn. So it took 7 years. And when they were having the sort of last ceremony rites with his father there in the coffin, and I hadn't gone up with the family, and one of the matrilineal, she's the tribal leader, she grabbed me at the back of the neck. She's, you go up there and be with your boy. And that's when I knew, okay, I've somehow passed some level of test, because by shutting up, by doing the work, I'd learned Māori. I'd done, and I had stayed. And it was that they were looking for. And so I earned something. And so these were lessons that then, fast forward nearly a decade. And here we are in Mauna Kea, and we have the first Native Hawaiian genuine coming together protest movements against the building of the 30-meter telescope. By now, I'm Deputy Director of JCMT. I had seen the first protest 5 years ago, and I saw what was coming. And we'd been doing work in the community. We had been and it wasn't enough. And Caltech and 30-meter telescope weren't listening to us. And suddenly you had, instead of a few hundred, you had thousands of Native Hawaiians standing down there. They called it Native Hawaiian Woodstock. And I had known this was going to happen. So I was up on Mauna Kea at the Halakahaku and we were trapped at this point because we couldn't get through the access point. And I managed to convince the other observatories. I said, we need to get everybody out. We need to shut down. We need to move. And so this is the convoy of us coming down. And of course, at this point, I was the designated spokesperson for the observatories, which in the Native Hawaiians' mind was the same as TMT. We knew we were different. They didn't. So I was actually standing, this is actually a photo from the drone. There was actually more people than this. There were 6,000 Native Hawaiians. There were 62 TV cameras. And I hadn't slept for 72 hours. And I was back in front of all of them. And that was me looking pretty crap. This was from the press conference. And here I was again. I'd learned another Indigenous language. I'd been working with everybody. And here was me being the bad guy. All I could feel, and this was the view. And it was all over again. I'm like, I'm on the wrong side of this protest line. Don't they understand? Like, I have been fighting for the Native Hawaiian rights. I'm on your side. I felt I've done so much and I'm still the bad guy. I was thinking things like, this is the end of my career. I can't be on this island anymore. And definitely was, I just want this to stop. Maybe I'll just make things worse. I should just stay out of it. And I say this because there are benefits of staying in the conversation. This was actually a militant hug that they had for 5 minutes, I think, afterwards. That was also video televised. And so what I learned from here is, well, fear is our most primal motivator, and it is the hardest to overcome. But true progress, when you want to challenge, if you want to conflict and change, you can only find this if the people in key positions set aside their initial fear-based reaction. Understanding that it is initial and it is understandable is okay. but you need to stay in the mix even when it gets hard. So what kind of fears are we talking about? And hopefully you probably can imagine examples of this you've seen in your own life and in your own interactions. When you have confronting information given to you, these are some of the drivers for your reactions that I want you to think about. Fear of failure, fear of criticism, fear of a loss of control or power in a situation, and one I've already sort of touched on, this fear of damage to your self-image. This is the sturdiest thing in yourself, and fear of that damage can drive a lot of bad or poor behavior. So I'm going to talk about, if someone's giving a talk, and you will have seen bad reactions to someone giving a controversial talk before. And these are some of the ways I think people go about these sorts of things. It's like, okay, let's say someone says something that makes you uncomfortable. That made me uncomfortable. If you're not actually assessing that, I don't like it, I want it to stop. That's the background feeling. I want to stop feeling this way. The fear-driven decision, the person who told me this, they made me uncomfortable, it's their fault. I need to find a way to make them stop, and not just make them stop, make them be sorry for making me feel uncomfortable. So the fear-driven action that comes from that will be, and you will have seen these, maybe suddenly you're focusing on a detail in their talk that you're finding that should be wrong. Right? You didn't probably even care about this topic before you sat down, but now you're going to find that thing that's wrong. You're going to drive down on it and make sure that they admit that they're wrong. You'll attack tone, wording, minutiae, extremism arguments, ad hominem attacks. They're all fear-based. Then you might double down, especially if that person refuses to apologize for making you feel not good. So then suddenly a thing you didn't even mind an hour ago, now you have to win. Now you need to feel soothed because the speaker will have to apologize or backtrack on what they did. So that's the fear-driven response chain. What could you do instead? That made me uncomfortable. Huh, interesting. That's making me really unusually upset. What's that? What's triggering this in me? Let's take a moment to unpack that. That's a way to now start to look inwards of why this is making you uncomfortable. Some options on the table. Okay, that was weird. You can delay your initial response. Give yourself a moment. Before reacting to, ask yourself, will my comment or my question or this reaction add to the conversation, or am I making this about me? Because chances are if you're making it about yourself, perhaps that's not going to really add to the conversation in the room. You can level up too. So the people who are really, really valuable when you're having uncomfortable conversations are the ones who've had all of that and then have gone, all right, I get it. This is uncomfortable for me. That means other people in the room might be uncomfortable. Is a contribution from me necessary, or can I also help others maybe in the room to move to a more constructive place? So that's someone who's actively engaging and recognizing that their triggers are there, which means probably someone else or more than one people in the room is also doing that. How can you help to get them to a place where they're recognizing that as well? So some hard lessons now. And I learned this one in both New Zealand and Hawaii. It's never about you. You have to have a ruthless and very practiced self-analysis to overcome fear-driven reactions and make good decisions. Am I being honest with myself about why I'm doing this? Am I more worried about how it looks than how I'm getting this to the outcome that I think needs to happen? And a lot of times if people aren't sure about that, if you're not sure, this is where you need a little group, right? Some people you can go to and say, hey, this reaction, is this appropriate? You need to have some people perhaps you can trust who are going to evolve you to a place where you can do that for yourself. Always have people you can check in and are going to give you that honest reaction. It's not going to help if they give you that honest reaction and then you ignore it, by the way, because that's another loop that you've got to unpack. Holding two truths at once. And this is what I learned in New Zealand, and it's really vital to know this, which is everyone is the hero of their own story. I always used to joke that maybe I'm actually just here to prove as a warning to others, but it really is true. So no one ever goes out there planning to be the bad guy. And so the self-image fear is that instead of thinking that people are seeing you as the bad guy, it's also worse to think they're not thinking of you at all, right? Maybe you're not that important a cog in the scheme of things. And so it's important to step outside of your hero story and say and recognize that there's also those different perceptions outside of you, and that's okay, right? You're allowed to be the hero of your own story and insignificant in someone else's. So you can have both. You can have awareness that you have good intent, that you've done good works, that you care, that you try, and still be okay with the fact that you might be in certain contexts representative of an institute or a practice or a culture that has harmed and continues to harm other people. That's also all right. It's important to know those two things are not in conflict with each other. You're a good person. That is still okay, and be a representative of inequity, injustice, and inclusion. And the more you step up into leadership roles, lying to yourself that you aren't going to be representing some of these things is not helping anybody. So it's okay to be both of these things. In fact, it's very important to have this level of self-analysis. And I would argue to you that some of the best leaders of successful change in the world are the ones who get this inherently. Okay. So noticing fear-based reactions in yourself and others. I mentioned this already. If you're forcing someone to back down from their point because you didn't like it. Yes, but. Okay. Not all men, my favorite phrase. You know, trying to say, well, but yes, okay, fine, there's these horrible people, but not everyone, right? It's an example. Shifting responsibility. Yes, it's all world and horrible, and I'm completely powerless. I can't do anything about it. And this is the really key one. Stopping the discussion. Since you think so little of me, there's no point even continuing this conversation. And this is fear-driven, always. Departure as a punishment is the easiest and most common way to kill progress, because you can just stop the conversation. And when those in power delay or cease the discussion, and I'm sure you're thinking of political ones where you can imagine these things have happened, it is the easiest, at least it's the easiest way to stop what would otherwise be the least damaging and most lasting path to social change, just by walking out of the room. And so if you're in one of these positions, the most important thing you can do is to monitor in yourself whether you're leaving a vital change-making process because it's uncomfortable for you. And that's why leadership matters. It's a catalyst result to say that 45% of employee experiences of inclusion directly result from their managers' behaviors. Leaders set the standards. It's as simple as that. They decide what behavior is allowed, what is supported, what's overlooked, what's rewarded. They decide how many women or other underrepresented minorities are on teams, or if they're going to be treated in ways that enable them to thrive rather than just survive. So when you're looking at fear-based decision-making in groups and teams, right, this is another really interesting one. Maybe notice someone's trying to exclude some people from that process. Maybe there's a narrow individual focus that means that no one's got the perspective on the real big, the final vision, the final goal. There's a quest for control within the decision-making process, and distrust removes the chance for really being open and honest. Refusal to consider open options, to champion their own. Information gathering is just to prove someone's specific point rather than being unbiased. You might see participants hop on a certain, favorite opinion and then just not get off it, no matter what else is given there. You don't look at all of the paths, the majority or authoritarian rule. And here's one: decisions don't stick. You might make something and then, maybe we won't do that again. Maybe that's too hard. Both winners and losers make poor learners. And then you get into what I call the fear spiral. Dissension builds, fears increase, dissatisfaction, you bring up other stuff, and soon you can't decide on anything. And so what are the leaders who can walk into situations like that and actually bring a cohesive change movement to some sort of successful outcome. Well, I would posit, and there are many very good examples of leaders who possess this, and it's a talent called shifting. You have to develop self-awareness of your actions and how you're perceived first. But then once you have that, you have a master skill of conscious leaders called shifting. It's moving from closed to open, from defensive to curious, from wanting to be right to wanting to learn, and fighting for the survival of yourself and your self-image to a place where you are secure and you trust. And when you have someone who can do this, the next stage of shifting is bringing other people with you. So from this place of people recognizing they're being listened to, they're being heard, they're being appreciated, that even their very awkward or painful message is being actually absorbed, those are the leaders who really successfully take change movements and make them lasting. Here's a couple of examples where you can shift if you're in a decision-making place. Yes, but my hands are tied. I wish I could help you, but you know, the red tape, that's all too difficult. Yes, and I see my responsibility is to change the current administrative barriers that could solve this problem. This is too big. I can't fix the whole world. There's no possible way I can do anything to help you. What is the first thing that we can do to work together to make an improvement? So how can you calm someone else down? You could be the most enlightened person in the world, but if everyone else in the room is freaking out, well, we're not going to get any further either. So one of the first things to do is don't make it personal. Help them to not feel targeted anymore. And this, this is very much trying to remind them it's not about them. What is this about? This is not targeted at you. Find a safe road. What is the easiest path? What is the path of least resistance? If they can't handle all of these things, what is the one they can handle? Get baby steps going them in the right direction. You have to acknowledge people are having difficulty with this. I get a lot of feedback that it's like, Jess, you're like someone who's run 2 marathons and someone else hasn't ever run a race before in their lives. You have to go all the way back to the starting line and bring everybody along with you. And I have to remember that a lot of the time, right? So it is important to come back and remember you might have progressed in your thinking a lot further than others. And that's not their fault, but you do need to make sure you have the patience to go back and work with them on those steps. Incentivize the work. You catch more flies with honey than vinegar. If you can make it worth their while or worth the effort, then your chances of success are higher. And compassion is key. So this is a cycle. Sorry, it's a little bit hidden there. Breaking the fear cycle, there's only one thing, hope. So you can find what is a shared hope in the group that we want to achieve. What is a practice that we can do to maybe get there? And so you've got to find a path that very first off, nobody loses. And then from that, if you get a single win-win result, and then you see an improvement, that's when you start to get into a positive cycle. The sad thing about this is these are incremental changes. And one thing that I've learned, because I want the world to be all better yesterday, is that the bigger the attempted change, the harsher the pushback. And they're very, very rarely successful because of power vacuums. Incremental, steady state change is actually your best chance of lasting success. Here's one of the best shifting leaders. If you want to make peace with your enemy, you have to work with your enemy, then he becomes your partner. I would argue that no one worked more diligently and over the longest period of time, despite the fact that he had to work with the people who jailed him. True change takes time, consistency, commitment, and compassion, and you need leaders like this to do it. There's plenty of examples out there. I would say you have to have 2 things. You have to have the commitment from leadership, and you have to have the push from below. So South Africa, India, examples where you would have seen this. With some of the indigenous rights movements, one of the most successful ones being in New Zealand, consistent collective messaging. It's been a 30-year battle. They would argue with you it's been a 150-year battle to get to where they are. And they're not well off with it. They're just better than a lot of the other indigenous movements. So it is all relative. So these incremental shifts and compromise lines in the sand moral stances are the balance you need in order to prevent these sorts of pushback movements like Me Next from eradicating all of the progress you might have wanted to make. And most importantly, you need the right leaders in the right place at the right time. Okay, good. That's a little bit of time so we can have a chat. So thank you.
Okay, questions?
I have quite a few comments. Try to keep it short.
Sure.
So thank you very much. And apologies for being so.
I don't know, it's okay.
But a chance, maybe. Majority, I think it's win. Only in this kind of talks, majority win. It's just a comment. So I think it is within the average of if other institutions you visited. But just from experience, this kind of talks, majority women, not the opposite. Couple of things I want to say about the fears. I think that all the fears you described can be included in a category that is fear of losing identity, and this happens in many contexts. And, yeah, I think we should work together for I think this fear, which is maybe a bit more philosophical. It's deeper than like fear of like losing contact with reality, or fear of like losing a conversation, needing to be wrong. It's a bit deeper. So if we have to change our language, if we have to change our behavior, daily behavior, kind of accepting that we have to change our identity. And this is also part of accepting that maybe part of us belong to part of society that did benefit of some kind of people being in power and other kind of people being exploited,
Agreed.
or harassed, or whatever. So this, I think this applies to many fields. Sexual harassment or discrimination, racism. I think this is also your experience. You belong to a part of the society that did benefit of some kind of improvements, and people you visit in Finland where they were recognized. Second thing is about leadership. Good to think about leadership, but I think this should be something that belongs to the community. So each of us should not wait, in my opinion, that the leader comes and guides us, but like little steps. Day by day.
That's why you need both, right? You need the community integrity to say no more. We need something to change. My argument is arguably you need also to have leaders who are willing to be in the room with that. Otherwise, you can talk. I've got a whole talk on Arab Spring and the differences in the reactions of those movements depending on the leadership of those countries.
And my question to you in this sense is, if you met some people with leader in real life, and this for small groups, small environments, but of course leaders like Nelson Mandela, like
Yeah, I think one of the things we don't look at enough is leadership training and identifying people who are going to be our future leaders. It's actually essentially, with this hat on, that's basically my job. I'm trying to find the people who are willing to take on a path that goes towards these sorts of roles, because a lot of people take, as a prizes, some of these jobs. They're not prizes, they're not fun. And the people who figured that out and they're like, well, that doesn't look like fun. They're actually the ones you want in the roles, right? So it's something we have to look more to is bringing up who are these people and giving them the confidence and developing them. It's something I think we've lost a bit of a skill at. And we kind of accidentally luck on some people who have those capabilities. But we need to be a bit more systemic about it, I think.
Do you have examples in astronomy where things are working out well in this way? several of these institutes or this leadership situation is really, making great steps forward.
I mean, an example, and I'm biased, I will self-report that she and I, a colleague and also friends, but Lisa Cooley.
Yeah.
Does any of you know Lisa? So she's an Australian astronomer in galaxy evolution, but she's now the director for the Center for Astrophysics in Harvard. But in Australia, she got a $45 million grant to run a focus center, Astro 3D, for 7 years. And one of the reasons, not the only, of course, it was great, strong science, but one of the reasons was she promised Department of Industry and Science in Australia that they would be at gender equity across the entire organization within 3 years of startup. And she got there in 2.5 years. And one of the reasons was she went back and she was completely scientific about it. She runs these Monte Carlo simulations of every possible equity practice you can do. And she did it on the Australian, the demographics in Australia of astronomy. So they had all of the, how many PhDs, all of the institutes, what overtime. And she modeled, she's like, if we don't do anything, how long will it take us to get to equity? And the answer is never. And then she threw all of these different things into the bathtub model and said, which ones will actually make a difference? It's a very cool paper. Go and find it. It's in Nature. And then she just went and said, okay, these are the things we need to do. And one of the most interesting things she found is it doesn't matter what initiatives you put in place. Once you get to 40% female to male, it's self-sustaining. That's when you actually don't need all of these sort of more extreme seeming initiatives. And so she and I are now going to be working on doing this for the entire of the Netherlands and not just across astronomy, but in all sciences, just to see whether or not these, they're cross-cultural, are they cross-scientific institutes? And she's now at Harvard, and she's cleaning house. But yeah, so there's an example of a leader who is taking a scientific approach. And I would say, and at the moment, is showing great success. Yeah.
What was the hardest thing you think you had to learn along the path?
To shut up, to be honest with you, particularly when you're on the other side of these change movements, like you are in some of these indigenous cultures. My only job in a lot of these conversations is putting into the lens the people who actually need to be speaking. And my only job on the other side of it is making sure that their voice is respected and heard. You certainly become, and that's it. And just taking your own ego out of it. It's not about you. And if you just have to repeat it like a mantra, you end up not being in these things for it. There's not a lot of, day-to-day reward in a lot of it. But it is, it is worth it in my opinion. But yeah, so those were the two things. Yeah.
I mean, it might sound a silly question, but instead of, let's say, waiting to be confronted with a situation that drives fear, do you have example of like small exercise that one can do kind of every day just to practice that switch in you? Do you have examples?
Well, I mean, I have my dorky mantras for myself, and everyone has their own, flavor of these, but particularly if I'm going into certainly challenging conversations and discussions where I will be triggered, and I won't lie to you, my biases are there. And particularly if I'm confronted by a wall, as I usually am, of a demographic, which is generally older, white and male, I get my fighting shoes on and I have to, and so for me, those are sort of things that I have to de-escalate in myself, which is really important because otherwise we're not going to get anywhere. So for me, my mantra is I just say it every time I'm about to have a challenging conversation, be brave, be kind, be wise. For me, that's my little trio that helps me, identify the things that I want to be. And the biggest one at the end of the day, and especially in a room with a lot of people who mostly, as I said, usually there are not many evil people in the world. There are a lot of people who are fighting in a corner of their own making, and everything that they're allowing their fears to drive everything that happens, and that's where most bad comes from. Trying to be compassionate, it's really hard sometimes, but trying to have compassion and empathy for the people that they're coming from a different perspective, because usually that de-escalates something faster than any other logic or anything else can do it. And if they feel listened to, even if right then the last thing I want to do is to listen to this person carry on about whatever it is, but if they feel listened to, that I find really a path to, well, a more likely path, you know, to success. And I will not tell you I succeed at it every time, but I try.
So maybe to give a concrete example, I mean, I've heard it more than once, especially with younger white male Anglo-Saxon astronomers, no?
Mhm.
That they would say something like, oh, I cannot find a job in astronomy because I'm not
Mhm.
a black lesbian female handicapped person, no?
Yeah.
And really angry as well,
Mhm.
no?
Yeah.
And as if it's somehow my responsibility. So how do you
Yes.
how do you respond to that concrete situation? Because they're
Mhm.
already fired up,
Mhm.
and I'm like, well, you know,
Yep.
maybe you could try. It doesn't say anything here in the app that the job cannot go to you, so maybe you should apply anyway.
Mhm.
But how do you respond to that?
I mean, these are sort of the defensiveness is where some of my compassion runs out earlier than most.
Yeah.
And so it really is one of these things where half of it is giving context to say, well, what's really sad for me to hear you say is that I understand why, you know, these are the hard jobs. This is getting one of these jobs is eye through the needle. But what's a real shame is that you're blaming, you know, the most hardly put upon group that is also working in this. That's a real shame to hear. I'm sorry to hear you say that, because then that's so to trigger it is to say, reminder, what you're saying is really cruel. And I remind people of this when they have the conversation. We did active bystander training. I call it sort of psychological first aid course. Had a lot of pushback on it initially because, well, I'm a good person. You don't tell me what's a good person. It's like, well, yeah, but this isn't that. Right? This is kind of like doing first aid. You know, you see someone get hurt. Don't you wish you might have had the skills choice if you had the choice to help them out? Active bystander is like that. You get to be able to say, oh, look, they're in a bit of a difficult situation. Perhaps I can help. Whereas what you do when you blame everybody else for your bad luck, and like it's like, well, I can't even look at a woman. It's like, congratulations, you've just given all of the women in the room the responsibility of not making you feel bad.
Yeah.
Good job. Congratulations when you complain, right? That, oh, it's that black lesbian, you know, handicapped woman, instead of, you know, your limitations and your skills, and just simply saying, wow, it's a really tough job market out there.
Yeah.
And, you know, I recognize the likelihood of me getting this job is probably going to be small. I want to hear more, you know, less mean-spirited language in all of this. So what I do ask people for is a level of professionalism in their commentary. You can think whatever you want, but what I also find is I'm not wanting to censor people, but I will stop people when they're being unfair in these manners and say, I'd like a little bit more awareness from you that you know, that is really going to be hurting a group and a demographic, and that's not necessary. And the more you do that, and you do these little course corrections in the way people say things, it also then starts to change the way you think about it. So there has to be a level of understanding, and there has to be also a level of code of conduct. These are not things that are okay to say out loud.
No.
And there's a reasonable expectation of professionalism that gives people a social safety. And I'll be frank, that's where my compassion stops. My one job is to create a safe environment. And if I see someone not doing that, that's where, yeah, the brakes are off for me. It's like, no, it's very easy to create a socially safe environment, to restrain yourself to professional conduct. But it's astonishing how much resistance you say to this. And then back to sort of something I said earlier, you know, the sense of identity being threatened. You know, if you've never been asked before to check your behavioral, you know, boundaries, it's a really scary thing. Like, I really do have empathy for people who are like, oh, I didn't, you know, when you're suddenly told, you realize that you've been saying something that's rude and offensive all of this time. That's awful to find out. But it's also still a reasonable thing to be asked to do. So that identity shift there, you know, it is really something which shouldn't be underappreciated how challenging that is for some people, and particularly if they've never had that that boundary there before for them, it can feel incredibly restricting. No one gives up power willingly, even if they didn't know they had it in the first place.
Another question, and then there's also a question in the chat.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see the chat.
But so I feel like the higher you get on this leadership, the lonelier it gets. And it's kind of a position where at some point you really struggle to like find support. How do you deal with that?
Badly. But also we are setting up, for example, peer networks, especially for women in leadership and senior roles. I'm really committed to making sure no one is lost. And it's really important the more isolated you get. So I am always for finding other ways in connectivity between women, and not just women, any underrepresented minority who's in leadership roles. And if you're intersectional, everything is magnified to a horrible degree. And so it really will come down to mentoring and knowing people need to know they have backup and support. And one of the best ways you isolate and remove change leaders who have represent in some of these underrepresented minorities is to isolate them and then exercise them, right? So if you don't feel that, they can't do that to you, then you're more likely to have leaders that stay and can affect the change they need to make. So we have to look out for each other, especially when we internalize the misogyny, you know, and we're not the leaders for our own group that we could be. So it's not a perfect system. What's the okay, Jochi is saying, oh, in the Netherlands, the Tim de Zeeuw case. Has there been any next resistances? Okay, that's a tough question.
Do you want to read it out? Or?
Sorry, yes, I will. In the Netherlands last year, it was made public the case involving the high-profile astronomer Tim de Zeeuw in Leiden. Has there been any of these next movements or resistances from astronomy's hierarchical structures in the Netherlands after that? If so, how has the community reacted to fight it? Wow. I actually, one of the things that I saw in the Tim de Zeeuw motion, I mentioned it very briefly, was I saw a really positive thing in this, one positive thing, which was he was due to retire at the end of the year. 5 years ago, they would have just quietly put him out to pasture and not done what they did. Instead, they made a decision to do this. I saw that as a win for the next movement, actually. So that was sort of the first thing I'll make a statement on. But what did it do? It did unearth, systemic, that this was not an isolated issue. There was, many people who had experienced this, and yet, the community as a whole had sort of just accepted it. So, there was a bit of, I think, reaction to that. There's never not that. But I think for the most part, I find the Dutch community to be quite cohesive, recognizing it was like, no, this was serious, this is important. We have NIAC there, so we have a national equity and inclusion committee for astronomy. And so their idea, and I think that, well, they hired me. I think that's actually an example of a community that's looking forward and saying, yeah, okay, we need to shift some of our representation and we need to up the conversation on this. So the short answer is no, not yet. I haven't really seen a lot of pushback to this. I've seen, I think we can still do a lot more self-reflection though,
I think one of the complications in the Tim de Zeeuw case is that he has been in a position of power for 30 years and he has populated the ranks of Dutch astronomy with his friends over this time. So it's very, very difficult to change the culture. I guess you still see his sort of former friends are still there in the system. You have to work with them as well.
Yep.
It's difficult to make that change.
And I mean, we can talk about the Marcy case recently, right, with the planet, the recent exoplanet paper, where, back there up on because, these people are so intrinsic in the field. My friend, she said, but Picasso, it's like, well, but the science. And like, if I hear that, well, but the science argument one more time, I'll get a little cranky, because it's like, you can be a good scientist and a good human, but we select in these leadership, and these big star roles. You kind of have to be selfish. We almost reward some of this behavior, and we need to stop doing that. And that, I think, it's the thing for me, changing the reward and recognition system to a more balanced playing field, where you acknowledge all of the other efforts that are not just being a PI on 100 million things and pushing everyone out of the way to make sure your name's in lights, because that's really the only system that we have right now, and we need to figure a different one out.
Yeah.
And I think, he's probably one of the more extreme examples of it, but look at the level of role he held and for how many years, and everybody knew, and yet it was just part of the culture.
Yeah.
And so it's the culture that I'm looking to change, and that's really hard.
But this requires a systemic change, no? Because like you say, we are identifying scientific achievements with individual names, with individual people. Like look at the Nobel Prize as an extreme example,
Yep.
but even so, it is important on publications too. The only position on an author list that counts is the first one, right?
Mhm.
It's So whereas really science is a team effort, so we somehow have to change the whole system of incentives and rewards in the profession.
So, I'll
Yeah.
point you to the draft of the new Dutch reward and recognition system in science, which is an attempt to point us in the right direction. It's encountering huge resistance from the universities because this upends everything that they work on. But women mentor more. Women put more of it's all in the stats of pushing their postdocs into publication roles. You're not rewarded for that. How do you measure that? When you're actually being a good workforce development, when you're actually a good, career developer. And these are the things we want to see rewarded as equally or more so. They're still doing the science, you're doing the science, but you're putting the young people's names at the top of that list. That shouldn't, and it does in ERCs, that hurts researchers and it hurts women disproportionately. So we need to start finding these new metrics for what we count as a good researcher. And that's sort of some of the examples of the things that you're looking at. I mean, outreach, community work, again, back to being a good human. Asking people, hey, in addition to them being an excellent scientist, would you ever want to work with them? Having reasonable awards putting to people that actually you put a human stamp on it. And it's very hard for the status quo because you can read a citation or H-index.
Yeah.
And some of these other measures are far more, you have to have different skill sets, and astronomers especially aren't great at some of these emotional intelligence decisions. So those are things we have to change as well. Yeah, systemic change.
Any other questions?
So, I was talking to Tamara Davis, who's a
Mhm.
professor in Australia.
She's a good friend of mine.
She mentioned that there was this effort in Australia to hire a huge number, large number of female professors.
Mhm.
He was at this Australian National University or something like this. And I thought this was really interesting, and was like, when we tried to say like, okay, is this something we could do here? Legally, apparently legally, there's like no way we can do this here. So I was wondering, in the Netherlands, is it possible to do something like this? Or have you found alternative ways
Mhm.
of, like favoring different?
Yes. It's a really good question. So the answer is yes-ish in the Netherlands. So they have done in a few universities there female-only hires. One of them then did get taken to court, but they did successfully win it. But it does show that there's a contention to this. Even women have a mixed feeling on this. Do you want to apply for one and then just have hearing, oh, well, she only got it because. In fact, in Australia, the opposite is true. They're finding they're getting more quality applicants for the female-only positions. Because when they were asked, women said, well, we knew we wouldn't have a hope in the open call, but maybe for this one, I would. So there's a mixed bag on that. I'm for targeted hires, right? So I put out a general call to say, I want 20 women, right? And so the good thing, now at ASTRON, we have a 75% female management team. Women hire women. Like, come work for us. I promise a safe place. I promise career acceleration. And you make this loud, right? And you say, come and work for us. That already, one of the main things I have a lot of male directors, oh, well, no women applied. I'm like, how many did you ask? You know, on your Rolodex, you know, all the men that you called, where were your women? I go to conferences just to recruit. I just sit in all of the women's talks at SPIE and hand them my business card at the end. And you need to have that overall effort. The second one is you need, my rule now, we're just bringing this in, will be a big announcement at the end of the year on equitable hiring. You have to, we will not progress with a recruitment unless more than half of the applicants are women at every stage in the application process. The panel, selection panel, has to have more than half women, preferably also a female chair. This does put a burden if you've got a low numbers early on. So you bring in external people until you get the balance better. But you have to have some lines like that. And then you start to see, we just hired our first 2 female technicians for LOFA just last week because we started in on this. And our guy who was hiring, oh, there's no women out there. But as soon as he looked, you know, and asked, then they start coming through. So we're putting, like I'm using every one of Lisa Cooley's demographics. You just do all of it. And you have to do the whole combination. We're doing guaranteed dual career hires. We'll do childcare support. Right? We are also making inclusive practice, not just to bring people in, but to keep them. And this won't be gender exclusive. This is for anyone turning up. So you can do a lot of things which are not just women only hires to start getting people through the door. But the first thing you have to do is make sure the people out there hear that you're looking, and that then secondly, they trust that this is the place that is worth coming to. And that's really, I think, the reputation that you have to put out there.
Okay. We keep going, yes.
I have a question on what you just said, and how the male staff, which are there since decades, some of them actually reacted to this.
Which the last part?
Change of policies that
Yeah.
brought.
You know, on the equitable hiring, it's been really positive, really interestingly positive. So, so that I've been really happy with. I think there's been more challenge on things like talking about codes of conduct and active bystander training. And most people who had resistance to it beforehand that I mentioned, when they went in and they had the training, they're like, oh, that was actually pretty good. So for 90% of people, that changed as soon as the trainings, you know, happened. And so I see more resistance on expectations of conduct than I do on the idea of having more women or you know, underrepresented groups within the team. So far so good. I think some of the resistance of, you know, well, we're just seeing women in these roles because, you know, not because they're any good, but just because we're putting equity, and that'll always be there to some extent. And the only thing you can do to make that go away is get to parity.
Yeah.
Soon as you get to these magic numbers, really a lot of these conversations stop. So you just have to charge through it and expect that there's going to be some negative pushback.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you very much again. And so
Thank you.
just to emphasize that Jess will be here the rest of the day, also tomorrow morning. There will be another talk tomorrow at the pizza seminar, but then about radio astronomy, the future of radio astronomy. So that will be very exciting as well. But if you want to talk to Jess, she is on the 3rd floor in office D302 this afternoon and tomorrow morning.
Yeah. Happy to. All right. Thank you. So good to be here.
Thanks a lot.